They came with fire in their eyes and steel in their hands. The cross meant nothing to them, and the cries of the holy women were drowned by the clash of iron and flame. To the monks and nuns of the Christian world, they seemed less like men and more like demons, creatures born from the sea, carrying axes that shone like lightning and hearts colder than the northern ice. The year was 793. Dawn broke over the island of Lindisfarne, a sanctuary of peace where prayer filled the air and seabirds circled above in silence. The monks rose to greet the morning light, unaware that this sunrise would be their last. Then came the horns, a sound that tore through the mist like a scream from another world. Long ships slid onto the sand, carved dragons at their prows, oars dripping with seawater, and from them emerged the Norsemen, their war cries echoing across the holy island. They spared nothing. The golden chalices, the carved crosses, the sacred books, all were torn apart, and those who could not flee were cut down, their blood mingling with the tide. It was the day Christ's peace met Odin's wrath, the day the heavens fell silent, and the age of the Vikings began. Centuries later, we would remember them as explorers, poets, and kings. Their sagas would glorify their courage, their voyages, their gods. But before they were legends, they were terror itself. This is not the story of adventure. It is the story of invasion, of how faith met fury, and how the purest of souls were broken by the coldest of hearts. What happened when these pagan warriors met the holy women of Christendom? The answer lies buried beneath ashes and prayer, in one of the darkest intersections of faith and fire that the world has ever known. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of savagery. It was the spark that ignited an age of fire, the beginning of 2 centuries in which the thunder of oars and the howl of war horns would haunt the coastlines of Christendom. From the mist of the North Sea, a new terror had risen: the Vikings. They came from the cold fjords of Norway, from the forests of Sweden, and from the windswept shores of Denmark, lands of long winters and hard men. Their world was ruled not by peace or prayer, but by strength. To live was to fight, to conquer, to take. They believed that only those who died with a weapon in hand could earn a place in Valhalla, the golden hall of warriors. And so they lived by the blade and died by it. But the Christian lands across the sea, England, Ireland, Francia, were built on a different kind of power. Monasteries and convents dotted the landscape, glowing like islands of light amid a world of war. Inside their stone walls, monks and nuns prayed for the salvation of mankind, copying holy texts by candlelight and feeding the poor who came to their gates. They believed in mercy, chastity, humility, virtues that the Norse would have scorned as weakness. To the Vikings, these sacred places looked like easy prey. They glittered with gold and silver, chalices, crucifixes, jeweled reliquaries. The faithful had poured their fortunes into these sanctuaries, believing them to be protected by heaven. But heaven's walls were made of faith, not iron. No soldiers guarded these holy grounds, no swords defended their altars. The Norsemen saw opportunity where others saw sanctity. They came in their longships, sleek, shallow vessels that could glide across oceans and rivers alike. They struck like lightning, swift, brutal, and gone before any army could respond. Coastal monasteries were the first to fall, then towns, then entire kingdoms trembled. Word spread quickly, of fire, of slaughter, of sacred places desecrated. Chronicles written by trembling monks spoke of the wrath of God descending from the north. But it was not divine punishment. It was human greed, sharpened by desperation and driven by hunger for glory. In the sagas of the north, the Vikings called these raids Vikinger, adventures, journeys of courage and conquest. But for the people they attacked, it was apocalypse. Among the most vulnerable were the women of the cloister, the nuns, the brides of Christ. They had renounced the world, sworn vows of purity, and dedicated their lives to prayer. Behind convent walls, they tended gardens, cared for the sick, and sang hymns to the Virgin Mary. They lived not for earthly pleasure, but for eternal salvation. Their white veils symbolized innocence, untouched by sin. But to the raiders, They were something else entirely. Symbols of the enemy's weakness, living embodiments of a faith they neither feared nor understood. The Norse gods demanded strength and blood. Odin hung from the world tree to gain wisdom. Thor split giants with his hammer. To such men, the sight of women cloistered away from life, denying desire, must have seemed unnatural, even insulting. So when the longships landed and the warriors broke through the convent gates, pity was rare. The crosses were torn from walls. Relics were melted into arm rings. And the nuns, those who survived the first wave of violence, were taken. Some for ransom, some for sale, and others for far darker fates. To the Vikings, taking captives was an ancient tradition, a mark of victory. Thralls, slaves, were part of every household. But to capture a nun, a woman vowed to God, was to claim not just a body, but a symbol of divine submission. The conquerors of the flesh became the conquerors of faith. The church would remember these acts not as battles, but as blasphemies. The annals of the time speak of sacred virgins defiled, holy places drowned in blood. And yet, the raids continued, from the English coasts to the banks of the Seine, from the islands of Ireland to the heart of Francia. What made the horror even more profound was the silence that followed. For every monastery that burned, another prayed for deliverance. But deliverance never came. The more the Christians begged their God for protection, the more the Northmen came, hungrier, bolder, crueler. And so, across the seas, heaven met the hammer. Faith collided with fury, and the quiet world of prayer was shattered by the roar of war. The chronicles call it the terror of the heathens, but the Vikings called it triumph. And in the ashes of broken sanctuaries, the songs of the nuns, once sweet and serene, turned to whispers of fear. For the women of Christ's house, the coming years would bring not just the loss of home or freedom, but of innocence itself. Because the raiders from the north did not come merely to steal or to kill, they came to conquer, body, soul, and sanctity alike. And for the captured daughters of the cross, the true horror was only beginning. The year was 793. The seas were restless that spring, dark and cold, as though the gods themselves were stirring beneath the waves. On a small, windswept island off the coast of Northumbria stood Lindisfarne, the Holy Isle. For over a century, it had been a place of peace. Monks and nuns lived there in quiet devotion, copying holy texts, teaching the poor, and praying for the souls of the living and the dead. The sound of the sea was their only companion. But peace, as history so often teaches, is only the calm before the storm. On a morning like any other, the bell tolled for prayer. The brothers and sisters gathered in the chapel, their chants rising softly through the mist. Then, from beyond the gray horizon, came another sound, faint at first, then growing louder, the deep rhythmic thud of oars striking the sea. Out of the fog they appeared, long, narrow ships, their hulls cutting through the waves like blades. The monks had never seen such vessels before, their prows carved into dragons, their sails striped with crimson and black. Some thought it a vision, others a sign of the apocalypse. It was neither. It was the north. The longships grounded on the sand with a hiss, and the men who leapt from them were like nothing the islanders had ever known. Tall, broad, wrapped in furs, their hair wild, their eyes burning with hunger. They shouted in a tongue harsh and strange. Then they advanced. The holy men tried to flee toward the church, clutching crosses and relics, calling upon the name of Christ. But faith was no shield against the steel of the north. Swords fell, blood splattered the stone walls. The chapel floor, once blessed with holy water, ran red. The chronicler Alcuin of York, who lived not far from Lindisfarne, later wrote in horror, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God." He called it a sign of divine wrath, that God had turned his face from the English for their sins. But the truth was simpler, crueler. It was the beginning of something new, the birth of the Viking age. The raiders tore through the monastery like wolves through a flock. They broke open the reliquaries and stripped the altar of its gold. They smashed the carved crucifixes and tore pages from the holy books, laughing at the monks' cries. The gleam of silver chalices caught their eyes, treasures beyond anything their frozen homelands could yield. And then came the taking of the living. Those too weak to resist, the old, the sick, the women, were dragged to the shore and bound. Among them were the nuns of Lindisfarne, who had devoted their lives to silence and purity. The Vikings had never seen such women, pale-skinned, veiled, their eyes full of terror yet strangely calm, as if still clinging to faith in the face of the end. To the Norsemen, they were more valuable than gold. The women were forced aboard the longships, their prayers drowned by the crash of waves. Behind them, the monastery burned, the holy fire consuming the last remnants of peace. The journey that followed was a descent into another kind of hell. Those taken as captives would be divided and sold. Some were brought to Dublin, where the Norse had begun to build a trading port. Others to Hedeby, in Denmark, the great market of the north, where thralls were sold beside furs and amber. The most beautiful, the youngest, were carried even farther, to the slave markets of Baghdad, through the hands of traders who spanned continents. The church would later record their fates in whispers. Some nuns became concubines in the halls of Norse chieftains, forced into pagan households as symbols of conquest. Others were given as gifts to jarls or warriors, their purity mocked, their faith ridiculed. Some, it was said, threw themselves into the sea rather than face such shame, but others endured, praying in secret, tracing the sign of the cross in the dirt when no one watched. To their captors, these women were trophies, tokens of victory. But to those who still believed, they were martyrs. The horror of Lindisfarne echoed across Christendom. News spread through the monasteries of Northumbria, through the abbeys of Francia, even to Rome itself. Pilgrims wept. Kings trembled. The age of divine protection had ended. A new kind of darkness had begun. For centuries, the faithful would remember that summer as the day the walls of heaven were breached. Yet to the Norse, Lindisfarne was a triumph, the first taste of a new world. They returned home laden with gold, silver, and slaves. The tales of easy plunder spread quickly through the fjords and villages of Scandinavia. Soon, fleets of longships filled the seas, heading toward the next monastery, the next abbey, the next shrine. Faith, once the armor of the weak, had become a beacon to the strong. The more sacred the site, the greater the glory of its desecration. The chroniclers wrote that the attackers were agents of Satan, but they were merely men of their time, their hunger, their gods. They did not come for souls, they came for survival. Still, the image endures. The holy women of Lindisfarne, their white veils torn by the wind, their prayers swallowed by the roar of the northern sea. Some vanished into slavery. Others became wives in faraway lands, raising children who would never know the God their mothers served. The monastery was rebuilt in time. New monks came, new hymns were sung. But the spirit of Lindisfarne was never the same. It had been baptized once more, not in water, but in blood. And so, the first page of the Viking age was written not in ink, but in fire and sorrow. The North had met the cross, and won. For the Vikings, it was the dawn of empire. For the Christians, it was the death of innocence. And for the captured daughters of the faith, it was the beginning of a nightmare that no prayer could end. Because on that day in 793 AD, the daughters of Christ became the spoils of Odin. When the longships vanished over the horizon, the flames of Lindisfarne still burned behind them, a holy island reduced to smoke and silence. But for those who had been taken, the nightmare was only beginning. The sea became a prison without walls, and the north, their new and merciless home. To the Vikings, slavery was no shame. It was the pulse of their world, the hidden engine of their wealth. Every farmstead, every market, every hall was built upon the backs of thralls, as the Norse called their slaves. Without them, the great longships would have no rowers, the harvest no hands, and the markets no merchants. In a society that worshipped strength, the weak became currency. By the 9th century, the Viking slave trade had spread like veins across Europe. Long ships carried their human cargo along every river, from the coasts of Ireland and Britain through the heart of Francia and deep into the east, along the Russian rivers that flowed to the Black Sea. From there, Norse traders reached the glittering markets of Byzantium and even Baghdad, where pale-skinned slaves fetched the highest price. Among these captives, Christian women were the most prized. Their skin was fair, their hair light, and their foreign faith made them symbols of exotic beauty, objects of both desire and dominance. The Vikings, who believed that fate was carved in runes and strength was sacred, saw in these women the perfect contradiction: fragile, pure, and utterly defenseless. The nuns taken from monasteries and convents were considered treasures. They were educated, rare among women of the age, able to read, sing, and speak Latin prayers. In the courts of Norse chieftains, such women were trophies of conquest, displayed like jewels or relics. Owning a Christian nun was not merely possession, it was a statement that Odin's sons had triumphed over Christ's daughters. But for the women themselves, the fall from sanctity to servitude was a torment beyond words. They were forced to abandon their vows, or watch others die until they did. Their holy names were stripped away and replaced with Norse ones: Astrid, Freydis, Inga. The language of their prayers was forbidden, the sound of the cross replaced by the chants of Odin's priests. Some were taken as breeders, valued for the foreign blood they could bring into a lineage. Others were given as offerings to the gods, sacrificed in rituals meant to bless a voyage or ensure victory in war. To the Vikings, these acts were not cruelty, but custom. To the church, they were desecration. Arabic chroniclers such as Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met the Rus Vikings along the Volga River, describe their slave markets in chilling detail. They are tall like palm trees, fair of face and body. The girls are slaves, and they are taken before the men, who buy them for their pleasure. Frankish sources too speak of the white slaves of the north, women from Christian lands, sold in droves, carried like cargo to distant shores. They were chained together in the holds of ships, their tears lost among the waves. Some would never see land again. Yet the Vikings saw no sin in this. Their gods demanded no mercy. They believed that fate was unchangeable, and the strong had the right to rule the weak. What mattered was honor, wealth, and the song that would be sung of one's deeds. In that song, the suffering of captives was not tragedy, it was proof of power. Still, among some Norse, a shadow began to stir, a faint unease at the suffering that surrounded them. As the years passed and Christian captives began to live, bear children, and whisper their faith in secret, the iron world of the north began to crack. Imagine one such woman, a nun from Northumbria, torn from her convent and sold in Hedeby, Denmark's great trading port. She once sang hymns in a candlelit chapel, now she labors in a smoky hall, the property of a warlord. At night, she hides a small wooden cross beneath her clothes. When no one watches, she presses it to her lips and whispers the prayers she once spoke freely. Her master does not understand the words, but he senses their power. She is no longer Sister Mary of Lindisfarne. She is Freydis, a name she hates. Yet even as she serves her captor's household, she remains unbroken. Her spirit endures, fragile but alive, flickering like a candle in a storm. For many women, there was no such endurance. Countless captives perished in the frozen winters of the north, their graves unmarked. Others were absorbed into Norse families, their children raised in a world that worshipped the hammer instead of the cross. Their faith faded with time, their names forgotten, yet their blood lived on, quietly altering the destiny of the very people who enslaved them. The Vikings may have believed they were taking slaves, but in truth, they were taking seeds of a new faith, one that would one day conquer their gods. Even in the darkest corners of the north, whispers of Christianity began to take root, not through kings or missionaries, but through these women, these broken saints. They taught their children fragments of prayers, stories of mercy and forgiveness, words that would one day replace the sagas of slaughter. It is one of history's bitterest ironies. The same hands that carved runestones in honor of fallen warriors had once torn veils from the heads of holy women. The same ships that carried swords and gold carried the faith that would one day end the age of the gods. And yet, for every future convert, there were countless victims, those who were never freed, never remembered. Their suffering was the hidden cost of the Vikings' glory, the shadow beneath the saga. By the time the raids spread across Europe, the slave markets of the north had become an empire in themselves. Dublin, once a small Norse outpost, was transformed into a city built on chains. Hedeby thrived, Bergen, Birka, Kaupang, all flourished on the traffic of human lives. The sagas that celebrate Viking heroism rarely speak of these women. Their names do not appear in the poems, their fates not sung in the feasts. But their silence is the truest testament of all, the silence of faith buried under centuries of conquest. The Norsemen would carve their stories into stone, boasting of raids and victories. The Christians would carve crosses into their graves, mourning the lost. And between those two stones, the runestone and the cross, lies the unspoken story of every nun, every captive, every soul that was taken from the light into the frost. The Vikings called it wealth. The world remembers it as horror. And history still whispers their truth, that in the long twilight of the north, the daughters of Christ wept in silence as the gods of war feasted on their sorrow. The fires of Lindisfarne had barely faded before new flames rose farther south. The raids multiplied like a storm spreading from shore to shore. No convent, no abbey, no holy house near the sea was safe. The Vikings had learned that where bells rang and hymns were sung, gold waited, and those who guarded it would not fight back. In Northumbria, one such convent lay hidden among the marshes. It was a small, humble house home to fewer than 20 women. Among them was Sister Ethelwyn, a woman of gentle heart and quiet faith. She had entered the convent at 17, devoting her youth to the Virgin, believing she would never again hear the world's clamor. But the world came to her. The longships landed in the night. By dawn, the convent was ash. The old abbess was cut down before the altar. The younger sisters were seized and bound. Ethelwyn was taken aboard one of the ships, her white veil torn from her head and cast into the sea. For days she wept, her prayers lost to the roar of the waves. But even in chains, she prayed, silently, secretly, tracing the sign of the cross upon her skin when her captors looked away. Her journey ended in Hedeby, the bustling Norse port where traders, pirates, and kings crossed paths. She was given to a pagan chieftain named Gunnar, a man famed for his ferocity in battle. To him, Ethelwyn was a prize, proof that even Christ's brides could be broken. He renamed her Svala, the swallow, and ordered her to tend his hall, to sing when his men drank, to smile when he demanded it. But though her voice trembled, she never sang their songs. Instead, she sang her own. Quiet Latin hymns of faith and mercy, words her captors could not understand. At first, they mocked her. Then they fell silent. Even Gunnar, the warlord who had dragged her from the altar, grew uneasy when he heard the strange beauty of her prayers. One winter night, he asked her why she prayed to a god who had not saved her. She answered softly, "Because he will save you." It is said that Gunnar never forgot those words. Years later, after the first Christian missionaries reached Denmark, his name appeared among the earliest converts. Whether truth or legend, the tale of Sister Ethelwyn, the slave who turned her master's heart, became one of the whispered miracles of the age. But not all stories ended in grace. Far to the south, near the city of Nantes in Brittany, another tragedy unfolded. In 843, the Vikings descended upon the region during the feast of St. John. The faithful had gathered by the river to celebrate Mass, singing hymns in the open air. Then came the longships. The attack was merciless. The church was set ablaze, and hundreds were slain. A nearby convent, known as Saint-Cyprien, was plundered. Those who survived the fire were driven north in chains, forced to march barefoot through mud and frost toward the waiting ships. The youngest among them, still little more than girls, were sold as slaves in the markets of Rouen and Dorestad. Chroniclers wrote that some of the nuns died on the road, still clutching their crucifixes. Others, when offered freedom in exchange for renouncing their vows, refused, whispering that their true bridegroom waited in heaven. Their names are lost, but their courage lives on in the words of Ermentrude of Tours, who wrote, "The barbarians may take our bodies, but never our souls. The Lord's hand reaches even into bondage." Yet history also records those who did renounce, not out of choice, but out of despair. Some women, broken by captivity and grief, adopted the ways of their masters. They took Norse husbands, learned the old tongue, and raised children beneath the hammer of Thor. In time, they forgot the psalms they once sang. Their faith did not die suddenly, it eroded like stone under water. And still, something of their spirit remained. Even the Norse sagas, written generations later, carry faint echoes of admiration for the Christian faith. In stories of kings and warriors, there are mentions of white-robed women whose courage and serenity baffled their captors. The sagas never name them as nuns, but their presence lingers, women who prayed to a god of mercy in a world ruled by the sword. In the saga of the Vikings, a dying warrior is said to have asked for baptism before the final battle. When questioned by his comrades, he answered, "I wish to meet the god of the white women, whose faith does not fear death." Whether fiction or truth, such tales reveal a paradox, that the very faith the Vikings sought to destroy began, drop by drop, to enter their hearts. Over the years, these whispers grew. Slaves taught their masters fragments of scripture. Captive women taught Norse children to pray before sleep. The stories of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints spread quietly, not through conquest, but through suffering. It was an invisible conversion, slow, fragile, and unstoppable. The Vikings had come to erase the faith of the cross, but found themselves surrounded by it. They had taken the daughters of Christ, yet could not silence the songs in their hearts. In their halls of mead and fire, prayers began to mingle with oaths. The cross began to hang beside the hammer. In the twilight of the 9th century, missionaries from the south began to arrive, brave men who preached in the markets of Hedeby, Ryby, and Birka. They found not savages, but people already half-turned toward the light. Many who came to hear them were the children of Christian slaves, men and women born between two worlds. The paradox was complete. Those who had come to destroy Christianity would one day kneel before its cross. Through pain and blood and bondage, the faith of the vanquished became the soul of the conqueror. The Norse gods would fade into legend, their temples would crumble into earth. But the prayers of the captive nuns, whispered in the shadows, carried on the wind, endured. And when at last the kings of the north were baptized in the name of Christ, it was not the voice of power that led them there. It was the echo of those forgotten hymns, sung by women who refused to let faith die. The nuns lost their freedom, but not their faith, and in time their prayers conquered the north. By the dawn of the 10th century, the fires of the Viking age began to flicker. The long ships still sailed, the axes still gleamed, but something had changed in the north. The gods of thunder and war no longer ruled alone. A new faith had crossed the seas, not in conquest, but in whispers, in memories, in the trembling prayers of captives who refused to forget their God. The conversion of Scandinavia was not a single moment. It was a slow storm, gathering over generations. The old world of Odin and Thor gave way, piece by piece, to the sign of the cross. And beneath that transformation lay a haunting truth. The very blood shed by the Vikings became the foundation of their salvation. In Denmark, the first great shift came with King Harald Bluetooth in the late 900s. Harald, once a pagan warlord, declared himself Christian and raised the great runestone of Jelling, inscribed with the words, "Harald who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian." The stone still stands, half carved with the serpent knots of Norse art, half engraved with the figure of Christ. It is a monument not only to power, but to repentance. Harald's conversion was as political as it was spiritual, yet it symbolized something greater, the merging of two worlds that had once stood at war. Beneath the surface, the memory of the raids endured. The monasteries that had burned, Lindisfarne, Iona, Nantes, became places of legend. Monks and nuns whispered of vengeance and forgiveness in equal measure. And yet, slowly, the north began to atone. Where once stood the charred ruins of churches, new chapels were built, this time by Viking hands. On the Isle of Man, Norse settlers carved crosses beside runic stones. In Norway, chieftains who once offered slaves to Odin now offered their own sons to baptism. The old sacrifices ended. The blood on the altars was replaced by holy water. Among the most striking of these converts was Olaf Tryggvason, king of Norway. Olaf's grandfather had been a raider, a man who boasted of burning monasteries and taking white-robed women as slaves. Olaf grew up in exile, wandering from court to court, hearing stories of both Norse gods and the Christian faith. When he returned to claim his throne, he did so not as a pagan conqueror, but as a Christian crusader. He built churches where his ancestors had spilled blood, ordering his people to accept the new faith or face exile. Historians debate his methods. His conversion was zealous, sometimes brutal, but even his fanaticism carried a strange symmetry. The sword that had once destroyed the cross now defended it. It is said that before his death, Olaf prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. Forgiveness for the sins of his fathers, and for the countless souls taken in the name of power. His prayer, real or imagined, captured the essence of a generation trying to escape its own shadow. In the quiet halls of York, once ravaged by Viking raids, a monk wrote, "The Northmen who once brought us death now come seeking life. The same hands that burned our holy books now build altars to the Lord." Such was the paradox of the North's redemption. The grandchildren of those who had dragged nuns from the altar now knelt before priests. Pagan warlords became patrons of the church, endowing monasteries, funding missions, and sending their sons to be educated by the very faith they once despised. The transformation was not merely political, it was spiritual, cultural, and deeply poetic. The Norse saw in Christ not weakness, but strength beyond death. To warriors who had lived by the sword, the story of a god who conquered death itself was irresistible. Slowly, the cross and the hammer were no longer enemies, but echoes of one another, symbols of courage, sacrifice, and fate. Yet the ghosts of the past did not vanish. In every new church, beneath every polished altar, lay the unspoken memory of what had come before. The blood of martyrs, the screams of holy women, the smoke of burning abbeys. Priests who preached forgiveness did so with the knowledge that their predecessors had died by Viking hands. But perhaps that was the point. Redemption does not erase sin. It redeems it. The church taught that even the darkest crimes could become seeds of salvation, and in the North, this teaching took root like no other. For every monastery rebuilt, for every Viking baptized, there was the unspoken acknowledgement that their faith was born from their guilt. The Viking story, once drenched in violence and defiance, became one of reconciliation. Their saga, the saga of the North, turned from a hymn of conquest to a confession of the soul. By the 11th century, the transformation was complete. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden stood as Christian kingdoms. Longships now carried missionaries instead of raiders. The same seas that once brought terror now carried the message of peace. In the ruins of Lindisfarne, monks rebuilt the monastery stone by stone. Pilgrims came to kneel where the first Viking blades had fallen, and in a small chapel near Trondheim, a simple wooden cross was raised, said to have been carved from the mast of an old warship. It was there that a priest once spoke these words. The blood of martyrs became the seed of conversion. The hammer that broke the cross has become its servant. And so, from the ashes of their own cruelty, the Vikings found salvation. The raiders of the North, who had once silenced the bells of Christendom, now rang them in their own lands. The same people who had torn the veils from nuns now bowed their heads beneath the same god they had tried to destroy. The story of the Viking Age ends not in conquest, but in confession. And the echo that remains is not the clash of steel, but the tolling of church bells over the northern seas. From pagan flames to Christian thrones, the North was not conquered by armies, but by faith. History often speaks of conquest as triumph, of men who sailed with swords and left their mark upon the world. But beneath the songs of victory lie quieter stories, the kind that do not boast. Stories of those who lost everything, yet in losing, transformed the very world that destroyed them. The Viking Age began with fire and fear, with monasteries burning and holy women dragged from their sanctuaries. To those who witnessed it, it must have seemed as though heaven itself had fallen silent. The prayers of the nuns, the tears of the monks, the shattered relics of the faith, all swallowed by the roar of pagan fury. And yet, from that silence, something unexpected was born. The question lingers. Was their suffering meaningless? Or was it part of something far greater? Did those who died at Lindisfarne, Nantes, or Iona perish in vain? Or did their agony plant the seeds of a redemption the world could not yet see? For centuries, the North had worshipped gods of war. Odin the All-Father, Thor the Thunderer, Frey the Giver of Strength. The Vikings believed that only courage in battle could grant immortality. But through their captives, the nameless nuns, the enslaved monks, the broken but unyielding believers, they met a different kind of courage. A courage that did not draw its power from the sword, but from faith. Those women, mocked, beaten, defiled, prayed not for vengeance, but for mercy. Their lips whispered forgiveness when the world gave them none. And somehow their voices carried farther than the screams of their tormentors. The same men who had burned churches began to build them. The same sons who were raised to honor Odin now knelt before the cross. The same blood that once soaked the altars became the lifeblood of a new faith. It is a cruel mystery that redemption so often demands sacrifice. But perhaps that is the price of salvation, that through suffering, humanity learns humility. The Vikings came to conquer, but they were themselves conquered, not by armies, but by a truth that no blade could cut. Their longships rotted, their gods faded into legend. But the faith they tried to destroy still stands. In every church that rings its bells over the northern seas, in every prayer whispered in the lands they once called their own. They thought they had silenced the voices of heaven, but the hymns of those nuns still echo across the North Sea, carried by the wind, whispering of faith, fury, and forgiveness.